Naturalism, in attacking the distinctions between observations and theories, or observations and statements about observations, claims that it merely seeks a connection or unity between them, between observations and statements. That is like saying, seeking unity or connection between life and death is a noble pursuit intended to find peace, harmony, and dialogue between them, rather than malicious attempts to reduce life to death or sight to blindness and darkness. Naturalism claims that since there is no concept or one category for sight and statement, no category for the distinction between sight and speech, therefore the distinction is not known objectively, and as such, the distinction or light of sight is not real, since not objective. It is not reality, but ideology, that of supremacy. Only within the ideology of naturalism, sight is supremacy. The truth, however, is that the distinction between light of perception and speech belongs to light of sight above. In consequence of these false assumptions, naturalism argues that in the absence of real distinctions between identities, in this case, observations and theories, or between knowledge and reality, naturalism concludes that reality does not exist, knowledge does not exist, and also the relation between them does not exist, since they do not exist formally as an instance of a principle. Of course, it would help if the ideology of naturalism was actually referring to reality, to knowledge, and to the link between them. When naturalism claims that observations, or simply light, needs to have objective relation or link with that towards which it is directed, it is essentially claiming that unless light has or is under law, justifying or legalizing shining or expansion of light through darkness, then it is not a light at all. Unless light includes darkness, it is not light. Unless light is under law, it is not light, claims the ideology of naturalism. But we must ask the naturalists, why should light, rather than reason trying to capture light, be the one needing justification of its own existence, especially given that the self-referring reason is occupying light's place? Naturalists assume that nature or the default natural position is darkness and not light. But why should men of light not regard naturalism as unnatural to them? What if observation, sight, and light are our being, soul, and not some idea requiring the establishment of natural science to explain a way out of existence? Natural science's primary target for destruction is sight and your soul. Natural science exists for no other reason. The Dark Age is the exclusive goal of naturalism, to extirpate sight out of reality. So what is the main fallacy in all this naturalist thinking? The distinction between subject and object, or between sight and speech, or observations and theories, only within the ideology of naturalism is not real, since the ideology itself is not and cannot be referenced to reality, and as such, it is referring neither to sight or speech, or theories or statements, or even to subject or object, nor to the distinctions between them. Rather, it refers to their attempted ideas. Naturalism is referring to nothing but ideas, not to reality or to the world. All that remains now to show is that all those equalities, or more correctly, equations of the ideology of naturalism, are not about reality. They are not reference to reality. They are not claims about reality, but rather are about a postulated theory or idea of reality, wherein which perspective is not reality but ideology. In that sense, the statements of naturalism about the world are not statements at all. They are submitted by ideology, a standpoint, not in reality. Start with the induction problem itself. David Hume presents the induction problem in the following way. How do we know that the past will resemble the future? How do we know for certain that the places not seen will resemble the places we have seen? How do we know that the instances which we have had no experience of will resemble those which we have had experience of? How do we know the unobserved or inexperienced reality will resemble the observed or the experienced reality? How do we know X will cause Y? How do we know that ought to follows from what is? How can we derive normativity from description? Naturalists tell us we cannot derive oughta from what is. We cannot know what actions ought to be taken based on reality alone. Do these naturalists even hear themselves? Reality is the only one we can derive what ought to be done. Men derive knowledge, what ought to be, exclusively from what is. That is the difference between naturalists and men. Naturalists are theorists and self-doubters. So how do we answer Hume? The answer is simple, because it does not require brain power, but honesty. The answer is there is no two. There is no unobserved reality. There are no places unseen or futures unobserved as an element of an equation between subject and object. There is no such thing as either observed reality and the unobserved reality as an equation of reference, since reference is not an equation or equality. Sight does not include thinking. To equate is to form idea, concept, class, or category. But what if there's no category for reality and for truth and for speaking what you see and for light to shine? Then such equations are not equations of real things. In this case, the observed reality and the unobserved reality, but rather those are attempted concepts of those things. And we know that because equating points of reality can only be authored by gaps in reality. By ideology, that is. Ideology does not enter reference as reference. Truth or sight is not a principle of law. Observation, sight or reference, is not made of two elements like naturalism claims it is. Sight plus mind equation is not sight, but just another attempted ideology of naturalism. Sight is light. There is no such thing as the unobserved as part of equating it to the observed, so-called. The observed and the unobserved should not be equated, like they are equated by naturalism in order to form method, principle, law, as the way of referring to reality. Why not? Because it is both evil and incorrect to equate sight to anything in order to make sight or light something other than it is. Reality, sight and speech are realities independent of each other, and it is immoral to equate reality with ideology so as to reduce reality to nothing. It is wrong to attempt to equate light to darkness in order to find law that would legally permit light to shine through darkness. Light needs no justification to shine, just like truth-telling or observation and speech expressed need no justification to be expressed. Truth needs no justification. Lies do. Equations do. Equating sight to mind does need justification. Equating knowledge to nature does need justification. Equating one part of reality with another part of reality does have some splaining to do. Words, by contrast, need no justification. In order to continue being words, that is, to be about reality or references to reality, instead of rejecting the author of words, the skeptic should reject doubt. The distance between light and darkness belongs to light. The distance or the border between observations and theories belongs to observations. To the observer, to the author, independently existing, it belongs precisely to that which natural science denies independent existence, arguing in turn that since there is no concept, idea, law of principle between perception and conception, seeing and thinking, sight and mind, therefore neither one can be independently verifiable, and therefore neither one is real, absolutely, necessarily, certainly real in itself. And in the absence of certification of independence, that is, of objective verification, of propagating or shining naturalism, concludes that neither sight nor mind is real. Or maybe you are just referring neither to sight nor mind. According to the doubter, sight is just a figment of your imagination, and inequality and pollution and toxicity to be eradicated, we are told. All these reasonings of naturalism are false, since naturalism is referring neither to sight nor to mind, but to their attempted ideas. What naturalism fails to find is not justification for the relation between observations and claims, or sight and mind, or observations and theories, but rather justification for the incomplete concept of the relation, as well as concepts between attempted ideas or attempted concepts of light and attempted concepts of mind, attempted concepts of theories. The very attempt to to equate reality to ideology results in self-reference in statements not about reality. We know this because the author of the statements is itself not reality, but ideology, naturalism. Ideology cannot begin to refer to or be about reality. So, the answer to David Hume is there is no two because there is no one. There is no one because you, the self-referring naturalist, have not begun referring, since naturalism is counter-reference in itself. In reality, there is no multiplicity or duality, since there is no singularity, so-called to begin with, which the ideology is referring to. There is no inequality, because there is no equality. That is only inequality, and that is only equality from the vantage point of privilege. The privileging to equate in order to form categories and ideas over and above reality, namely over and above the relation between subject and object, God and man. There is no duality, as that is only duality from the vantage point of singularity, which is incomplete, which is to say, which does not exist. There is no two, since that is two only from the vantage point of the one which does not exist. It is merely an attempted one, attempted knowledge of the so-called nature. Half theory is not a theory, as it is missing an author. The author cannot be another theory, and incomplete at that. So there is no two, as that is only two from the vantage point of the one, which itself is just a postulate at best, therefore lacks the status of reality or being, and possesses only that of an idea, and incomplete idea, since authored by another idea. The privileging of equating either the so-called equality with the so-called inequality, or the so-called science with the so-called nature, is the standpoint external to reality, which ironically, naturalism denies existence of, while itself being none other than that very standpoint. The standpoint outside of reality is simply ideology, and strictly speaking, it is not a point but a gap, a hole in reality. The terms of such standpoint include naturalism, nature, and natural science. All these noises are substitutes for language. They form counter-reference, which is the separation from God, separation which is pride, and elevation above reality. In the same way, there is no nature, as that is nature only from the vantage point of privileging, equating incomplete idea of nature with the incomplete idea of knowledge or science, since the vantage point or the author of all naturalist theories is itself doubt, a gap in reality. It is incapable to be qualified as reference to anything. Natural science faced this rather embarrassing self-defeat by abandoning its goal, which was the knowledge of nature. Now we are told the definition of science is no longer knowledge of nature, but elimination of the unknown. The objective is no longer pursuit of equality, but merely the elimination of the so-called inequalities or pollutions or toxicities, also known as the daily world of perceptions we enjoy. Whatever exists at the moment is necessarily wrong and evil because it exists outside our demons, outside categorizations, seeking necessary connections. In other words, because life, light, sight, truth, words, speech, and soul are not laws, concepts, or ideas, but are above the laws, are reality. Therefore, the goal of natural science must be not to humble itself, yield the trespass territory, and accept them as the primal, reality, and the starting point of life, but to try to eliminate them for the sake of elimination. This has been called by the naturalists the noble pursuit, death and destruction for the sake of death and destructions. Natural science falsely claims that sight is made out of two elements, seeing plus thinking, in order to eliminate the alleged duality between seeing and speaking or thinking, as if naturalism was referring to either sight or thinking, rather than to the attempted concepts of sight and thinking. In reality, sight is not made of two elements, such as sight and mind, or observations and theories. You know that naturalism is at its most destitute when it asserts that light is darkness, or, as natural scientists prefer to put it, perception is constituted, you see, of sight and something else, namely reason, your neural activity and photoreceptors. Desperately calling something photo gives impression that you are actually describing the indescribable light of sight rather than the mind and body, which you actually do. The naturalism's goal behind the physicalist arguments is to conclude that sight is not reality, but a property of body. Light is property of darkness, claims the Honorable Naturalism. Darkness is naturalism's starting point of departure, which to naturalism is self-evident and needing no explanation or justification for elevation over light. It is light and the world of perceptions, or the world of inequalities, we are told, that needs to justify itself. The correct response is to simply reject the entire twisted ideology of naturalism as reference to reality, to reject it as language. It is not a language. It is not a word. It is the lie.